It's August 1942, and on this day, Operation Jubilee takes place. This will be the largest combined operation attempted by the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, and France since the war began. It will be called the Dieppe Raid, but should have been called the Dieppe Massacre. Over 3,600 men will be killed, wounded, or captured. So why did the Allies send their men to almost certain death? So what happened at Dieppe? Well, let's start at the beginning. The Allied plan was to take out several German artillery batteries that were threatening shipping in the English Channel. These batteries were located around the French port of Dieppe, which at the time was occupied by Germany. If you want to find out where Dieppe is, then don't worry because we've got you covered. Now back to our story. On the 2nd of August, 3 days before the raid, a small group of commandos infiltrated the town and blew up 2 locomotives and 5 railway carriages. This was done to disrupt the expected German response to the coming attack. On 19th at 5:15 hours, the Royal Navy began moving into position off the coast of Dieppe. In total, they provided 237 ships and landing craft for the operation. At 5:30, smoke bombs were dropped over the town to mark the start of the operation. At 6:15, a naval and aerial bombardment began. This was to last 15 minutes, after which the landing craft would go in and the troops would take the beaches. All seemed to be going according to plan. However, as we now know, it wasn't. And that's because of one man. Lieutenant General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces, had insisted on personally leading an attack on Dieppe. Why? Well, he wanted to get his army noticed. But there was a problem. De Gaulle didn't tell anyone that he was doing this. And therefore, when the Free French troops landed, they were spotted immediately and driven back to their ships. Only one of the main assault objectives, the battery at Varengeville, was successfully taken. Of the 6,800 troops that took part in the raid, only 2,100 made it back alive. Of those that didn't, some had their hands cut off to allow them to escape. Others were shot at point-blank range. And even worse, some were thrown into the sea and left to drown. So who were these men? Why did they take part in this botched raid? And how did it influence the DA landings just 2 years later? Well, over 6,000 troops took part in the Dieppe Raid. The majority were Canadian soldiers, followed by British Commandos, American Rangers, and a small number of Free French troops. The Canadians were all volunteers. Men who had heard stories of the British Commandos, men who were angry at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and men who just wanted to do their bit. Then there were the British Commandos handpicked by their officers for their daring raids behind enemy lines. They were experienced fighters, toughened by years of fighting in the toughest environments. As for the Americans, well, they were part of the 1st Ranger Battalion. Handpicked by the U.S. Commander, Lieutenant General George Patton. You may have heard of him before. He was quite the character. We'll link to a video about him below if you haven't already watched it. But the Free French troops were probably the most interesting. They're led by Major Pierre Billet. They were part of the French resistance. They were the ones who gave the Allies intelligence on the defenses at Dieppe. But despite this, their involvement in the raid was kept top secret. And that's not surprising, considering that at the time, France was still officially a nation ruled by a puppet government. Planning the raid was difficult. The Canadians, Commandos, and Rangers were all trained for a beach assault. But once there, things would be very different. The troops would face strong opposition, something that hadn't really happened since the war began. The Royal Air Force flew more than 2,500 sorties during the raid, including fighter sweeps, close support missions, and transport duties. Many of the aircrew were from 42, 48, and 50 squadrons RAF, all of whom were veterans of the Battle of Britain. But perhaps the biggest threat to the troops wasn't the Germans or the French. It was the sea. The English Channel is cold, very cold. And if the troops were forced into the water, then hypothermia would be a real danger. And the raid started badly and got worse. The British and Canadian troops were hit by a sudden hailstorm. Some of the boats capsized, and many of the troops were injured. When the Canadians finally made it ashore, they found themselves under fire from the Germans. Within minutes, many were dead or wounded. What was supposed to be a quick 15-minute raid was turning into a massacre. To make matters worse, the Free French troops hadn't carried out their diversion as planned. And so the Germans were able to bring all of their guns to bear on the Allied troops. As the hours passed, more and more troops tried to get onto the beaches. Each one suffered the same fate. The Canadians soon realized that they had to withdraw. But how could they do this under such heavy fire? The answer came when they saw a large number of German troops heading away from the beaches. They had seen the Canadians and were heading off to investigate. This gave the Canadians the chance to slip away unnoticed. But it was too late for most of the commandos and rangers. By this time, the situation was desperate. With almost no ammunition left and casualties mounting, they knew that they had to get off the beaches, but it was almost impossible. The few boats left were damaged, and the Germans were now aware of the Allied presence. One commando officer described what happened next. "We spent the rest of the day hiding in shell holes, exposed to the full view of the enemy but fortunately hidden from the view of our own people, who, unaware of our plight, continued bombing the beach. At nightfall, we dug a tunnel out to the beach, leaving our wounded to sleep in the comparative safety of the bottom of the trench. Our intention was to hide until dark and then swim out to the boats, which were lying 200 yards off the shore. But the following morning, the raid was discovered and the Canadians withdrew. Most of the commandos and rangers were killed or captured. Only a few hundred made it back to England, many of them having to swim several hundred yards through rough seas to reach the waiting boats. As for the Germans, they lost 350 dead and 480 wounded. The Allies had launched a total of 308 landing craft and 383 other vessels. Of these, 33 landing craft and 21 other vessels were sunk or damaged, while 69 were damaged by mines. A total of 3,626 Allied service personnel were killed, wounded, or captured, and of those, 2,011 were Canadian soldiers. So why did the Allies suffer such heavy casualties? Well, the first reason was that the troops weren't told the whole truth about the raid. They knew that they were taking part in an assault on a heavily defended target, but they didn't know how heavily defended. Many of them thought that the worst that could happen was that they would be pushed back into the sea. They certainly didn't expect to be hunted down and killed. But the second reason was much more serious. The troops weren't given the right equipment. Many of the rifles were too old and couldn't be reloaded quickly enough. Also, the standard grenades were dangerous and didn't always explode properly. And the third reason was the weather. The storm had blown over by the time the troops landed, but it was still cold, very cold. And the men had to wait in the water for hours before they could land. Some of the men were suffering from exposure by the time they reached the beaches. Despite the heavy casualties, the raid was considered a success. Why? Because it provided valuable lessons that were used in the planning for D-Day in 1944, for example. It was decided that future raids would be better planned and the troops would be told the full story. Also, new equipment would be issued and the troops would be better prepared for the conditions they would face. But what happened to the troops after the raid? Many of the survivors returned home, but they were never the same again. Some of them suffered from shell shock, others from the cold, and some simply couldn't forget the horror of what they had seen. But there was nowhere for them to go and no one to talk to. So they kept it all inside. Many of them died, believing that no one knew about their sacrifice. But eventually, after many decades, their story was told. Thanks for watching.